Coming up on today's show, Sandra T. Jones is a licensed psychotherapist with well over a decade of experience living polyamory and working with clients in non-monogamous relationships. As a relationship therapist, they have taught hundreds of people the steps and principles for collaborative communication, conflict resolution, respecting the rights and autonomy of themselves and their partners, repairing and deepening relationship bonds, while being solidly affirming of LGBTQ+, kink, BDSM, and bi people of color. And now they're the author of a book that teaches this information, Cultivating Connection, a practical guide for personal and relationship growth in ethical non-monogamy. Welcome to Loving Without Boundaries, where we hear inspiring stories, share actionable advice, and talk about the challenges and the joys of ethical non-monogamy and polyamory. I'm your host, Kitty Shambliss. Coming up after the break, my conversation with Sandra T. Jones.
Are you bored with dick pics? Do random hookups and empty chats kill your vibe? Tired of being catfished or wasting time with messages from faceless profiles? Then you need to get Monogamish, a new dating app designed for singles and couples of all genders and sexualities looking for dates, mates, and everything in between. Access exclusive matchmaking events, workshops with dating and sexuality gurus, and exclusive offers so hot you'll just have to see for yourself. Download Monogamish for free from Google Play or the Apple App Store. Monogamish. Explore fluid relationships.
Welcome, Loving Without Boundaries community. I am super incredibly excited to be here with, I think what I can say is a dear friend of mine that I've gotten to know first at the Atlanta Poly Weekend. We realized that was back in 2018, and we've kept in touch all those years, even through the pandemic, and we've been supporting each other's work. So I am here with Sandra T. Jones. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And I'm really delighted to be here having this conversation because that means that the book is done. And we'd been talking about it on and off for years. And I was very, very supportive of Sandra's work in completing this because I was blown away, frankly, by the workshops that you gave back in 2018 at Atlanta Poly Weekend. And it was incredibly helpful for me personally in the relationships that I was in. I was there with a partner at the time, and we were having our own struggles. And also I could see how the information you shared was just stellar. So I'm so incredibly happy that you put your knowledge, your breadth of experience, that a lot of it is hard earned, into this book. And I know firsthand how challenging it is to write a book. Mine was a very short book. Yours is much longer. So I just want to start by saying thank you from the bottom of my heart for writing this book. So I'm delighted to have you.
Thanks. Thank you for writing your book. It was very inspirational for me. And I've had a number of clients over the years come to me and tell me, have you read this book? Because it was really helpful to me. So especially the clients struggling with jealousy, your book has been very valuable.
Thank you so much. It warms my heart to hear that. It's amazing. So I'd love it if I gave that short bio, but I'd love it if you'd share with our folks here a little bit about yourself in your own words.
Okay. So the longer bio is, I come to being a therapist from first being a client. I sounds like they are a club for men. I come from a background that was, I'm going to try and make it nice, really unfortunate. And so I came into young adulthood with a case of complex PTSD, anxiety, depression, and a whole host of other things. And of course, because of that, I wasn't functioning very well as an employee. So I was also very poor. And so part of my story is that I began my journey of personal growth and healing around the age of 21. I had to figure out how to access mental health care as a person with like zero money and no insurance, which was difficult. And eventually, as steps went forward and forward, but a lot of what helped me along the way was self-help books, because I couldn't afford to access actual mental health care. So that's part of where I'm at today, is wanting to give back to that. And that's a lot of why I've started writing these books, is to help people who maybe are either in a position who can't afford mental health care, or they want to use it to supplement their mental health care. But beyond that, I'm also a person who, this being a therapist is a later life career. Prior to that, I was doing home remodeling. I was a home remodeling contractor.
Wow.
Yeah. So one of my favorite hobbies now is still doing work on our own house. I just built a deck onto the house a couple months ago. I love pets and animals. We do a lot of fostering of dogs, not cats so much, but dogs. I have a cat, but we do a lot of foster dogs. We take care of them. I love saltwater fishing. That's about it.
That's awesome. That's fascinating. I didn't know that about the home remodeling. That's awesome. And I knew this was a later in life career. So it's cool to find out what people were doing before, they maybe step into their power. It's kind of what I think of you as just like stepping into maybe who you were always meant to be and the gift that you've been giving to the world. So I'd love to ask maybe a couple questions about going back into the past a little bit, if that's okay, in an effort to serve people listening. So one question I have that I think can be really relatable for our community here at Loving Without Boundaries is what I call the light bulb moment. Like, was there either a moment when you were either quite young or in your youth where you realized that maybe you were different from some of the other kids, whether different meant in terms of your sexuality or in terms of consensual non-monogamy, whatever it means to you? And it could be like a series of moments, but however you could answer that would be great.
Yeah, I think the series of moments fits well. I was just thinking it's more like a string of lights. So the first one starts when I was about 5, and that was very related to gender. And I remember standing in the yard watching my mom and dad scream at each other and realizing she has no power at all, none, and he had all the power. And I totally connected it to gender at the time. It had everything to do with he had the paycheck, he had the louder voice and the more intimidating physical presence, and she was completely dependent. And I just saw that, and something shifted in me in that moment. And I realized that I really identified with that masculine energy, and I started refusing to wear dresses and insisting on wearing pants and Snoopy t-shirts, and wanted to play with guns and build forts. And it was just sort of that moment for me where I connected my identification with gender to interpersonal power. So that's really a big one. That's the first one. Later, the next one was sexual orientation. And I have to say that was a light bulb that was not lighting very well. There were lots of signs when I was in high school that I was attracted to girls. Like the time that I was on the swim team and I was swimming and I was watching a girl a couple of lanes over, and I was watching her so much that I hit my head on the end of the pool.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
And no, I'm oblivious. I mean, I'm pulling myself out of the water, holding my head, and I look up, and my swim coach, who is this, well, I look back and I'm like totally a dyke. But of course, no one was out back then. It was a long, long time ago. But she's just standing over there looking at me going, well, you're going to figure this out pretty soon, kid.
Oh, man. I'm curious, how old were you there? Was that
17?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this was back in the 80s, and people didn't come out or realize their sexual orientation nearly as young as they do now. But I was 17, and I figured it out about a year later when I joined the military and found myself in a very same-sex setting, and it was rampant. And I was like, oh.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So let's see, what was the next one? I think the next one was probably in my early 30s, and I had a girlfriend that cheated on me. And I remember having no sexual jealousy at all. And I thought that was odd. It's like, I was angry that she lied to me. I didn't like it that she made me look like a fool in front of other people, but I didn't care that she fucked someone else. I was just like, yeah, so you fucked other people before me. Why do I care if you fuck somebody after me or in the middle of me? So I thought that was interesting. And then it was still years later, because I'd never heard of polyamory or ethical non-monogamy or consensual non-monogamy. So it was about the time that I started graduate school to become a therapist that I met my current partner, who was saying on the dating app that she was in a polyamorous relationship. And I was talking to a friend of mine who was a longtime dominant in the kink community, and I was just bemoaning that I wasn't meeting anyone, and she said, "There's no one on these dating apps you're interested in?" And I said, "Well, there is this one girl who's really cute, but she's in a polyamorous relationship, and that's not what I'm looking for." Mm-hmm. And so my friend says, "Wait a minute, you're a busy graduate student. Maybe a part-time girlfriend is exactly what you need." I was like, huh. So I hadn't thought of it that way. So that's how my polyamorous journey began. And of course, I had all kinds of monogamous programming in my head. I thought it had to be limited to part-time girlfriend. I didn't realize it was okay to catch feelings for her. So she was a beautiful guide every step of the way through unlearning those things. And of course, she handed me the book, Ethical Slut, and said, "Read this." And it's my favorite book for anyone beginning the polyamorous or non-monogamy journey, because it's just so thorough and so wonderful. Mm-hmm. That was probably the final. Oh, no, not the final light bulb. The next light bulb, again, was gender. And that was 2017, I think. And I had been drawing pictures of myself with a beard for decades. I said to people for many, many years, I don't have penis envy, I have beard envy. I just want a beard. Just give me a beard. And I would, and this urge would come up really strong. And then I would ask myself that question over and over: am I transgender? Do I identify as a man? And the answer I always got back from my deep inner core self was no. And so then I would go, okay, then you have to put this away. And I would. And then somewhere around 2017, I was cruising through YouTube and I ran across this non-binary person who had had top surgery. And I was like, boy, that was a big light bulb. I can do that. 4 months later, I was with the surgeon. It was that quick.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. So I don't miss these at all. And I definitely don't miss bras. And I did start taking testosterone a couple of years after that. And I stopped again because I was starting to lose the hair on my head, and that not an option for me. So there's this young comedian. I wish I remembered their name, but I don't. But he does this cute little stand-up routine where he says, "I stopped taking testosterone because it turns out I'm more vain than I am trans." And I'm like, I feel seen.
Wow, that's
so that's my string of light bulbs.
Yeah, no, I love the analogy of a string of light bulbs. I don't think anyone's ever said that before, and can really picture that in my mind. I also just want to thank you for really vulnerably sharing that series of moments, those light bulb moments, and how you maneuvered through that. And also, it takes sometimes maybe some courage to be able to vulnerably share that. And I'm sure a lot of people here can relate to that, including that what you shared about how people weren't out as much back then. And now it is more acceptable. And also that's partly even why I started this podcast, was to normalize these conversations,
yes.
To get these conversations out there to as many people as possible so that we are talking about it. So thank you for being one of those people.
Sure. I love your mission.
Oh, thank you.
That mission of helping people to love and embrace that truth and to live more ethically. It's a beautiful mission.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a labor of love for me as well, I joke around that I'm a recovering Catholic, so I had to go through my own traumas and unlearn the things I needed to unlearn, to get to where I am, including dropping the shame and the guilt for identifying as queer and polyamorous and all of that. And it's a big passion project of mine, and it led me to meeting you back in 2018. So I love every step of the journey, and here we are. Look at us now.
Yeah.
So with that, author,
fellow author.
Yes, exactly. I'd love to ask you, why did you decide to become an author, and maybe what was the light bulb moment for why you decided to write this book as your first book?
Okay. So like I said, I depended a lot on self-help books when I was young. So I kind of always had a dream of writing self-help books at some point, especially once I decided to become a therapist. And that was after some 30 years of work on myself. I decided I'd finally done enough that it wasn't so risky to risk leading other people, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So this particular book, as I was working with people in the non-monogamous communities, I found an incredible amount of confusion around boundaries in particular. It's like when something I want, it goes against what a partner wants, how do you know when to have a boundary, when to defend a boundary, when to compromise, when am I being controlling, when am I giving away too much? And so I started writing blog posts to try and articulate this more clearly. And it became a series of 4 that then got picked up by a local magazine. And when it got picked up by a local magazine, I was like, maybe I should turn this into a book. And so that's really the core of the book is answering that question of I think boundaries will always be confusing if people think they need to build them around their feelings, because we can have painful or difficult emotions around all kinds of things, but those difficult emotions don't always mean I need a boundary, because half the time I need a boundary is really me controlling someone else, so that I don't feel whatever this painful feeling is. The trick is when we feel those painful emotions to ask ourselves these questions of, is this a time where I need a boundary because this other person's behavior is doing damage to me? Or is this a sign that I have some growth I need to do? And so it doesn't come up until the second 2/3 of the book. The first third of the book is about collaborative communication and going there first for repairing our relationships. But the second 2/3 of the book is really the part that inspired me to write the book in the first place.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. Yeah. And I definitely, I think what's interesting is none of us have ever been taught any of this stuff, whether we're polyamorous, whether we're monogamous. Like the word boundary, I don't remember it ever being even uttered when I was growing up.
Yeah, really.
So, and when we're talking about these topics that are complicated, right? Like it becomes so important. And I really, and even when I was doing my own research, your workshops were some of the first places where I started to wrap my head around this concept of boundaries. And I even since then looked for books. I couldn't find anything. I couldn't find anything that also spoke to me. There was one I found that was really written through a very religious lens. And I couldn't get past chapter 2 because it was just almost exhausting. To read it through that lens, So again, that's why I think this work is incredibly important, and I'm glad that that's a crux of and maybe your motivation for writing the book, because it is so dearly needed. And I think that you also have a great way of expressing yourself in a way that's very understandable and relatable. So, yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
So for your book, Cultivating Connection, what would you say is like, who would you say this book is intended to be for, and maybe what makes it unique?
It's primarily intended for people in the ethically non-monogamous communities. I tried really hard to write it also as very affirming for people who are queer, people who are BIPOC people who are practicing ethical non-monogamy. I don't think I included anything in there about people who are doing voluntary sex work, although I work with that population as well. I just really wanted, so many of the things out there are very heteronormative, and though they're not like the book you referenced, I think I'm familiar with that book. And those very religious books, I can't get through chapter 2 either. But even the books in the ethically non-monogamous community just sort of are quiet about queer and kinky and maybe relationships that have a consensual power dynamic. And I wanted very much to write a book that was at least open for these people and as affirming as possible, so that they don't have to translate everything from that generalized way of writing.
And thank you for that.
Yes, thank you.
Very much so. Yeah, because I think there's people that a lot of times people will feel very stigmatized or misunderstood. So, or like they don't have anywhere to turn to. So I'm glad that it was written by somebody who is a part of that community for people in that community. Although I think what you share so far from what I've read, it could help anybody. I think you even say that in the introduction,
Thanks.
But it's through the lens of, I'm in your shoes. This is very non-judgmental and it's partly for you, though anybody could, really use this information. So it's almost like I'm thinking of a funny analogy of, I feel like people who are in a minority, we almost need, more support or more affirmation so that we don't feel so, again, stigmatized. So I really appreciate you writing this book.
Yeah, I think it's that representation. It really is important. Something as simple as seeing a gay character that isn't stigmatized in a TV show. There wasn't that long ago that we never saw that. So representation is important. And so even if it's just a matter of the examples in my book and having some of them being bisexual characters or people in same-sex relationships or people who are engaging in a power dynamic or kink activities, that representation is important, because otherwise I think we get really exhausted translating and trying to see ourselves in things where we're not represented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So the next thing I'm curious about is you also talk about the spirit of healthy relationships. And this is interesting too, because again, we're talking about relationships in general, but through this lens. Can you talk a little bit about your thinking around that, the spirit of healthy relationships?
Sure. It kind of came to me as this sort of an inspirational flow. And then I was asking myself, why am I putting this in the book? And I think my primary reason for putting it in the book is that so many of us grew up in situations where we have no frame of reference for what healthy looks like. And because we have no frame of reference for what healthy looks like, we don't know to hold out for it. We don't know how to take the measure of the health of the relationship we're in and decide whether or not it's measuring up. We've got no reference point. So I wanted to paint a picture of this. This is the spirit of healthy relationships. This is the attitude with which to come to these skills that I'm trying to teach, so that people can have that idea of this is what it might look like. And I guess it's a combination of both of those things. It's for people who don't have a frame of reference, it's to help give them a frame of reference. This is what healthy might look like for people. But it's also, as you learn these tools in the book, it's really important to apply them with the right spirit. If you're looking at this as trying to find evidence for this is why I'm right and you're wrong, that's not coming at this with the right spirit.
Right. So not the somebody loses and somebody wins kind of, which is very adversarial.
Yeah.
I love that. And I love, one thing that I really remembered from your workshops all those years ago was I didn't have the language for it, but I may say this incorrectly. Can you tell us about polyvagal theory? Am I saying that right?
Oh, yeah. You are. Polyvagal theory, yes.
Yeah, because I don't know if you use that language back in the workshop. I don't recall that, but I recognize the concepts when I was reading that part of your book. But if you could share that with our listeners, that would be awesome.
Sure. The guy who invented it, his name is like escaping my brain at the moment, but like everybody recognizes the name when you say it. But polyvagal theory comes from the actual study of the physical vagal nerve, which is this big nerve that runs from the brain back behind the voice box, down past the heart and down into the intestines. And interestingly enough, this nerve, and it's got two primary branches, is very central to how we feel our emotions. If you think about it, we really feel our emotions in our bodies. It's not just thoughts. It's not just in our heads. They coincide with thoughts. You might have worry thoughts, but what does anxiety feel like? I tend to feel it down here in my intestines as this like really uncomfortable crawly feeling, or some people will feel it more as their heart pounding or racing, right? But it's a physical embodiment, the way we feel our feelings. So I bring it into the book primarily for just the very simple task of explaining the fight, flight, freeze response. Because when we're in the fight, flight, freeze response, it had the polyvagal nerves are very related to which one of those you're in. And when we're in fight, flight, freeze, we lose access to a lot of the executive functions that in this front part of the brain. What is that called? Prefrontal cortex.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we lose access to that. So it impairs memory. It shuts off empathy, which is super important. If you're in an argument with somebody you love and empathy gets shut off, that's that moment you start to think that thing that you've been thinking for 2 weeks that you haven't allowed yourself to say, this is the right time to say it, because empathy is that filter that keeps us from saying shit like that.
Yeah.
But also it impairs other things like your ability to solve problems. It's just all kinds of things going on there. So I bring it into the book to illustrate for people what is the fight, flight, freeze response, why is it important, and primarily it's important because I'm basically trying to sell people on, I don't think it's a good idea to continue talking about a problem if either of the people or any of the people, if there's more than two, are in the fight, flight, freeze response. Because when people are in the fight, flight, freeze response, it's kind of like driving while impaired. You might get lucky and nothing bad happens, but it's really irresponsible, and the possibility of something bad happening greatly increases. Arguing with someone or continuing a difficult conversation when somebody's in the fight, flight, freeze response is like that. And so I'd like people to start thinking of it as it's kind of like driving while impaired. It's like talking to my partner while impaired. Bad idea, not responsible. Let's take a 20-minute break. It takes at least 20 minutes for that adrenaline to get out of our bloodstream, to hopefully get back up to what polyvagal theory calls safe and social mode, which is the only mode where we can really feel like we can connect to another person, empathize with another person, and connect in that way we need to if we're going to solve problems with a partner in a compassionate and collaborative way.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Yeah. And that was something that I really, again, remembered from your workshop so much, that that concept that when we're all going to have moments where we get triggered because we're human, so that's going to happen. But being able to recognize, oh, okay, I'm in that fight, flight, freeze response, and realize that your logical brain shuts down, your empathy shuts down. So it's kind of like your mind and your heart just go, boo,
Yeah, very much like that.
Yeah. And that concept that I don't remember that part about. I love the analogy of it's like driving while impaired. And I think it's important just to call it out. Like, it can be really irresponsible because I think it can feel seductive, oh, I just want to talk about this right now,
Yeah.
Or we can get pulled into that, but remembering what we're each responsible for. So being able to recognize when you're triggered and realizing that it's also your responsibility, but you can be collaborative with your partner. Like, hey, you kind of look like, maybe you're a little triggered. Like, maybe we should take a 20 or a 30-minute or an hour break. And so we're ready to have a productive conversation for the higher and greater good of us and our well-being.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I really appreciate that. So I'm glad that that's something that you definitely incorporated in the teaching in the book. And in terms of communication, we've heard a lot about nonviolent communication. I have my own thoughts about it, but I'd love to hear the way you relate to that and how you describe nonviolent communication and why that's important.
I bring it in primarily I think there's 4 steps to it, and I bring it in primarily for the first 2 because I also bring in the Imago exercise, which really covers steps 3 and 4. But I bring it in mostly for the part where Rosenberg describes that we live in a culture that teaches us to judge everything through the lens of right and wrong. And when we're talking to other people, especially when any sort of uncomfortable or painful emotion is triggered, we have a tendency to go, oh, I'm feeling this painful emotion. That thing caused my painful emotion. Therefore, that thing is wrong and bad. And the person who's doing it is wrong and bad. And then that's a lot of what's behind arguments is, no, you're wrong. No, you're wrong, And those first 2 steps of nonviolent communication teaches us that as long as we're doing that, as long as we're judging other people or things as wrong and bad, then we're stuck in this adversarial head-to-head conflict. But if instead you separate observations from judgments, and that's where those I statements that therapists have been well known for using since the 1960s comes in. When I see this, I feel this way. it takes away that adversarial tendency to point your finger at another person and say, you did a bad thing, which then invites the other person to just get defensive. No, I didn't. And you did something worse, So if instead of saying, you didn't wash the dishes, you irresponsible SOB, if instead we say, when I see dishes in the sink in the morning, I feel upset. It's way less threatening. It invites a more curious response from the other person a lot of the times. And it sets the stage for, at least potentially, a more collaborative conversation where people don't go into the fight, flight, freeze response.
Yeah, I think that's, I love the underscoring the part about that. It can be, maybe we're almost taught it. We see it all the time, that people can go into that judgment mode. And again, it's almost like seductive, like it just feels good, but then like a more responsible way to think about it is, and it's also inarguable to talk about, this is what I'm noticing, I observed, and this is how I'm feeling. Like we can't really argue with that. It's just that person's experience. And like you said, then we can also maybe have some empathy for that. Oh, okay. I get when you notice you saw this, that you then felt that. I got it, which then can really create a better dialogue. You mentioned Imago dialogue, and I'm curious how you mentioned that's how you feel it moves towards steps 3 and 4 of nonviolent communication. Can you talk a little bit more about how those two go together?
I seem to remember that with nonviolent communication, steps 3 and 4 involve asking very clearly for what you need. It's not breaking down into 2 different steps in my head, but I'm pretty sure that that's the sum of it. And the Imago exercise is an exercise that invites people to take the time for one person to speak and the other person to listen, and to listen for the sake of understanding the person who's speaking. And then you ask questions back and forth. They need to be open-ended, non-judgmental questions when you get to this place of really understanding what the other person is feeling, then you validate their feelings, tell them you want to work together to find a solution, and then you trade places, do the whole thing again. And then the last step is brainstorming solutions. So I think with nonviolent communication, step 3 was something about expressing yourself, and step 4 was asking for what you need. Whereas Imago is expressing yourself, being heard and validated, and then brainstorming what you both need.
I love that. Yeah, like again, bringing in that kind of teamwork philosophy of collaboration, and also taking turns instead of taking turns maybe slowly, instead of kind of sucker punching each other with the judgments.
Yeah, it's really interesting that I've actually seen it in relationship counseling when I'm working with people, that a lot of times, because time is short and we often only have a 1 hour or maybe a 2 hour appointment, people don't want to do something like the Imago exercise because it feels slow, and it's like, time is precious here. But if we don't use it, people do get into that back and forth of, this person says this, then this person feels like they need to counter it, and this person says this, and this person needs to counter it. And it stays in that adversarial, but this is how I feel, but this is how I feel. And they're both trying to be heard. Neither one is listening. And so they're repeating themselves, they're speaking louder, they're doing everything to be heard, but they're not being heard because the other one's not listening, and the other one's not listening because they're not being heard. So they've got to slow down, use this format. Once people master this format, they don't have to use such a time-consuming method, but the format's really helpful to get people away from this adversarial, like 2 boxers in a boxing match on opposite sides of the ring, to being a collaborative team, looking at a common problem. This thing is causing a rift between us. We both want the rift solved. Let's work together to figure out how to solve this thing. And it's a really good tool for bringing people back onto the same team.
Yeah. And I love it too, just in terms of, like, sometimes we do need to slow down in order to get to where we want to go, and that's the proper thing to do. And even coming back to that kind of personal responsibility, that we all want to feel heard. We all want to be loved and have some sort of a sense of belonging. And sometimes, slowing down and using some of these tools is the way to do that. And one other thing I really loved, I remember when I was reading the beginning of the book, you even mentioned that weekend at Atlanta Poly weekend, as well as a blog post And I did read that blog post a number of times after that. And one of the things I loved about it is you talk about human rights in a relationship. And so in the book, you mentioned some of the basic human rights in the language that felt proper for you. Can you just talk a little bit about how you came up with that and how that could maybe be helpful for folks who are listening?
Yep. How I came up with that. It's such a common thing. I think if you can do any Google search, and there are thousands of therapists who have something on their website about your rights when in a relationship, and they're all a little different. And what I was trying to do was come up with a list that I felt was really important for that, trying to figure out that line between when is something going to harm someone's mental and emotional health, and when is it going to contribute to their growth and the security they feel in a relationship. And so I came up with these 13. I also just really like the number 13. So it kind of feels natural. Things just fall into 13s for me. The spirit of healthy relationships fell into a 13, and so did this. I don't know why, but this is what came together for me. I feel like they apply to all relationships, really, between adults. They don't apply to adults and children, because children have extra needs and adults have extra responsibilities towards children. But when you're dealing with two adults, I feel like this list fits as much for the relationship between me and my mother as it does between me and my partner, me and my metamour, me and my girlfriend. And there was something else I was going to say about that, but I've forgotten what it was.
That's okay. It just made me think of a different question related to that, which is, how would you describe the difference between personal rights in a relationship versus boundaries?
Well, a boundary is built around our rights. At least that's what I'm trying to say. Like I was saying earlier, they're always going to be confusing if we think we're supposed to build them around our feelings. So what I did instead was I took this concept of, we should really only be building our rights around the things that we have a right to. I don't have a right to what somebody else does with their body. They have a right to make boundaries around their body. I have a right to make boundaries around my body. So that's how I came up with this list of rights, and our boundaries should be based on these rights. If we're trying to make a boundary around something that's not connected to one of our rights, then chances are we might be accidentally being controlling of someone else, and we're crossing over and violating one of their rights.
Yeah, thank you for that distinction. And I think we're kind of bleeding into partly my next discussion. I've never heard it put this way, but when we're talking about defending our boundaries, can you talk a little bit about what you share in the book between internal versus external obstacles to defending boundaries, and how that can be related to manipulation or consent? You can talk a little bit more about that. It's fascinating.
Sure. This is exactly where I see so much of that confusion in my counseling sessions. Is the external obstacles are obstacles that come from other people, and that's often other people's controlling behaviors. And that's where I see one person trying to tell another person that they're wrong for wanting something they want, or they're wrong for doing something, when I can see clearly that it's something this person has a right to decide for themselves. And that those external obstacles can be everything from guilt trips to emotional meltdowns to threats to end the relationship. What we've heard, I'm sure we've all heard the term weaponizing boundaries. That's where somebody weaponizes something to literally a threat. I'm going to end this relationship or leave you or do something damaging to you unless you do the thing I want. So those are the external obstacles, but we also have internal obstacles. And this is where I see people just giving away way too much of themselves, and then it damages them as individuals, and that's, many of us grow up in situations where we have either emotionally immature parents or very controlling parents or abusive parents, and you have normal needs as a child, and then your parent is yelling at you and telling you that you're selfish for wanting this thing that is totally normal. And so we internalize all this guilt that, if I express my needs, I'm bad. And that can take lots of different forms, from the religious forms of, this is how a woman should be, this is how a man should be, this is, how a person should be if they're honoring God. You've got all these religious guilt that we internalize. I'm sure you can relate to that.
Yes.
I was raised Southern Baptist, so I had my own recovery to do.
Yes.
But it's also, many people are like, oh, I'm being selfish if I do that. Or if I can possibly make it happen, I should, because otherwise I'm a bad person. And they are so reticent to put their needs or their wants first that they never get them met. They give away everything, and then they expect other people to recognize that and then give equally as much. And they're almost always disappointed. Why don't people do that? And they just often don't. So it's really important as individuals for us to learn where we need to put ourselves first. I often say to clients that everyone should be at least 51% selfish. The word selfish gets a bad rap. We should all be 51% selfish, because if we don't prioritize ourselves at least a little bit, because we all want to be ethical and treat other people well also. But if we don't prioritize ourselves just a little bit, that's our job. And I think it's reflected in when we start talking about attachment theory. One of the ingredients of that is we're supposed to strive to be securely attached within ourselves. That's the act of choosing ourselves and prioritizing our own needs and not being ashamed of that. And that's where it comes in.
So beautifully explained and expressed. And again, I think you just have such a great way with words of making things that can be confusing or complex really understandable. So maybe just to expand on that. So what I'm hearing is an external obstacle is if one book I really love is called Emotional Blackmail by Dr. Susan Forward. And the simple concept that emotional blackmail is when somebody is using fear, guilt, or obligation to try to get you to do what they want you to do. So that would be an example of in a broad sense of what external obstacles are, where and you need to defend your boundary, right? Whereas an internal obstacle is when somebody has maybe internalized beliefs. For example, with me being a recovering Catholic, right? So I joke around the way I was taught, it was almost like we were taught not to have any boundaries, to be very self-sacrificing, to martyr yourself. Everyone else's needs are more important, And so if I internalize those beliefs, that would be my own kind of internal obstacle that you might work with a therapist to overcome. I often, I love what you said about to be 51% selfish. Sometimes, and that's our job. I'm so glad that you highlighted that, because we can get confused about what's my work to do, what's your work to do. With my clients, sometimes I say, what if you try replacing the word selfish with, am I practicing self-care? So, but I love what you said too about we don't need to give the word selfish a bad rap. So I like that too.
But, I like the way you phrase it too, because a lot of people can have hangups around the word selfish. Selfish is automatically bad. I'm a terrible human being if I'm selfish. So if you've replaced it with self-care, we could also replace it with self-advocacy. I'm a big believer in work with whatever the client needs. And if they can't get past the word selfish, I'll use different words.
Yeah.
So
I love self-advocacy. Yeah. Sometimes I use self-empowerment. And but asking that, but then also asking that question, am I self-abandoning myself and my needs? Or am I overly self-sacrificing? I got this from one of my clients. They said, I'm not willing to light myself on fire to keep you warm.
I've heard that.
Yeah.
I've heard that. I love that.
Yeah.
I've also heard it as don't set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm.
Yeah. Yeah. So for people that it's a hard concept to understand, I think it kind of encapsulates it there. But I love this language of the internal obstacles, which are my responsibility to learn how to work through. And also if there are external obstacles, it's actually still my responsibility to learn how to defend my rights and my boundaries if that were happening.
Right.
Yeah.
And it gets more difficult because that's where power comes in. And I don't go into it. I go into it a little bit in this book, but I'm going into way more depth in the next book. What kind of happened was I was just writing and not paying attention to how much I was writing. And then I did a word count and found out, I have a 600-page book here. So I split it into 2 books, and the second book is probably 2/3 written. So the second book is going to go into much more depth of interpersonal power and ethics and what is manipulation and coercion, and basically when do you decide a relationship is so toxic that you pull the plug? Because a lot of us, again, have no reference, you know? And so that was one of the things that I learned along the way was in my younger years, I look back on some of my relationships and I was like, wow, I wish I'd had the tools then that I have now, because then I could have taken a measure of the health of that relationship and ended it a lot sooner.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Yeah. I often say that you don't know what you don't know. Right. So, sometimes we have to make those mistakes to learn. Right. I could talk about this all day, but I have a few more questions, then we'll wrap up soon. But one concept, and this is another thing I do remember from your workshop that was really powerful, is the concept of appreciation of when somebody is giving us a gift in the context of what we're talking about here. So if we relate that to creating a relationship agreement with a partner, can you talk about how to recognize that as a gift and why that's important?
Sure. So to tie relationship agreements in with personal rights, is a relationship agreement is an agreement to not exercise some iteration of one of my rights. So if we take, let's say, monogamy as an example, because that's a relationship agreement. If we each have the right to our own bodily and sexual autonomy, then we have the right to do whatever we want to with our bodies. If 2 people are deciding they want to be monogamous, then they are agreeing to this one thing. They're keeping their right to all the other ways that they can have control over their own bodies. They can still decide if they want to go on a diet or get a tattoo, but they're agreeing that as far as, and of course, people have different definitions for monogamy, but let's just go with sexual exclusivity. They're agreeing that as far as sexual activity is concerned, we're just doing that with us. So once they make that agreement, they have this expectation that they can trust the other person, that they will control and monitor their own behavior around that. So let's see, you were asking about gifts. Yeah. So when 2 people want the same thing, those relationship agreements are easy, right? It's when only one person wants something and the other one doesn't. And that's where, as 2 people are negotiating in this very collaborative, compassionate way that I outline in the first third of the book, you'll sometimes come to this place where it's like, what I'm hearing is my partner really needs this. It's not exactly my preference, but it's not going to damage me to say yes. So I have an option. I have a choice. I can say yes, and it will help my partner, and it's not damaging for me. If it's damaging for me, I need to say no. You know, even if it's painful to do so, if it's going to damage me, I need to say no. But if it's not going to damage me and my partner needs it, why not say yes? You know, it's a great expression of love to say yes. So by saying yes to something we don't actually want, we're giving a gift. And it's really important for our partner to recognize that that's a gift and to express appreciation for that gift. I think it's the lack of doing so is where we so often hear people say, I feel taken for granted. You know, the things I'm doing are not appreciated, you know? So by remembering to recognize that as a gift rather than claim it as an entitlement, you know, well, it's a good thing you decided to do this because it's that attitude of entitlement that does so much damage. So we recognize it as a gift. We express appreciation for it. The partner feels appreciated. It's positively reinforcing for everyone. It's a beautiful thing.
Beautiful distinction there. Yeah. So that concept of that, of the appreciation and recognizing that gift and how important that is for the other person to not feel taken for granted versus that feeling of, well, you should say yes anyway if you want to be in this relationship with me. You know, that like you said, that sense of entitlement. And sometimes when I'm talking about agreements, I say for the one who is maybe making the gift, you know, are you willingly, you know, meaning you're not being coerced, you know, are you willingly saying yes? And sometimes even joyfully saying yes, but maybe if it's not something they really want, maybe they couldn't say they're joyfully doing it, but they're at least willingly doing it so that they're not doing it from a place of feeling manipulated, you know?
Right. Or their own internal guilt trip. You know, those are the internal obstacles. Sometimes people will say yes to things they don't really want because they feel guilty. but sometimes they will say yes to things they don't really want because the other person is doing some sort of coercive or controlling behavior. So yes, it needs to absolutely be completely, authentically, willingly given.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's really important to do that investigation around that.
Mm-hmm. Incredible. Yeah. My last question is, and I thought this was amazing, was I've never seen this before, the personal responsibility flow chart that you came up with, that I was super excited to go find it in the book and check it out. Can you talk about how you came up with that and what that's all about? And of course, I do encourage our readers, if you find what we're talking about interesting, please go get the book, since you're not going to be able to see it right here. But yeah, if you could just maybe talk a little bit about that.
Thanks. I don't remember exactly how I came up with it, but what it is this very simple 4 questions to ask for that problematic moment of, am I being controlling, or am I giving away too much? Because that's the question that I see with clients over and over and over again. So it's these 4 simple questions. On one side, you can look at the other person's behavior and you can say, are they violating one of my rights? And if the answer is yes, then you absolutely should be defending your rights. Your job there is to get them to go back to respecting your rights, but have compassion for yourself, because your ability to do that is limited by your interpersonal power in the situation. So it's a lot easier if I'm doing a favor for a friend and that friend is being a jerk to me. It's a lot easier for me to say, you know what? It's not okay to treat me that way. I'm taking my ball and I'm going home. It's a lot easier to do that than if my boss is berating me and I am dependent on that job and that paycheck. That's much more difficult. And so it can really do damage to our self-esteem and our self-respect to be in a position where we don't have the power to advocate for ourselves and require someone to go back to respecting our rights. So I talk quite a lot about what we can do in those situations to try and repair that damage to ourselves. So that's the first question. If somebody's violating our rights, absolutely, we need to make them go back to respecting our rights. But if they're not respecting, if they haven't violated one of our rights, the next question we go to is, have they violated a relationship agreement? Because we depend on them to live up to those agreements when they agree to it. So if they are not living up to a relationship agreement, we're justified in being upset. You said you weren't going to do that, and here you did it, and now I'm upset. I'm hurt. I thought I could trust you. So if that's the case, though, all relationship agreements can be renegotiated, unlike our human rights. Those are non-negotiable. So if somebody has violated a relationship agreement, either they need to go back to respecting that relationship agreement, we need to do some work to repair the rupture in the relationship, or we need to come back to that relationship agreement and renegotiate it. And so people do relationship check-ins. A lot of times that's what happens in those situations. This isn't working for me anymore. We need to renegotiate this agreement. Mm-hmm. The flowchart can also be worked on the other side. I'm upset with myself, or someone is upset with me. Did I violate their rights? If the answer is yes, I need to own up to it, take responsibility, apologize. And if I did not violate one of their rights, then the next question is, did I violate a relationship agreement? If I did, I need to either go back to respecting that agreement, or I need to renegotiate it. If I didn't, and I unfortunately left that off the first explanation, if I did not violate someone's rights and I did not violate a relationship agreement, then I have work to do. And that's where it's the personal growth part. Mm-hmm. Why do I feel guilty if I didn't do anything wrong? Mm-hmm. Or if somebody is telling me I did something wrong, but I didn't, then I need to do some work there in learning how to defend my boundaries with this person. If somebody else violated my rights, or if they didn't violate my rights, or they didn't violate a relationship agreement, but I'm upset with them anyway, I have work to do. Maybe I'm the one being controlling, or I need to look at my insecurities and do some work around that. Or maybe my trauma has been triggered and it's time for me to stop avoiding getting that trauma treatment that I need to get, because avoidance is one of the key symptoms of PTSD. So it's very normal for us to avoid actually doing that work. But sometimes the world is like hitting us in the face saying, it's time to face that. Time to do that work.
Yeah.
Knock.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I'm beyond thrilled that you put this piece of work out there. This has been an amazing conversation. So thank you for playing with me today and going over some of the key concepts. I love just getting to talk to you again. And I'd love to have you back on the podcast and here for a Facebook Live if you're up for that.
So I would love it.
Yeah, awesome. So where can everyone find you and your book?
Okay. Well, my website's very simple, sandertjones.com, and you can pretty much find any of my social media links that way as well. My book is available anywhere you can get books. Please support your independent bookstores if that's something you like to do, because any one of them can order my book. I'm sure some of them also have it in stock, but of course it's also available on the Barnes & Noble and Amazon and all of that. So
awesome.
Yeah.
So cool. Well, thank you for your hard work, for being just an amazing human being, and the heart and soul that you put into this, including obviously all the hours and hours that you put into creating this work, and for your time here today with me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to today's show. If you like what you heard, are struggling with some aspect of your relationships, and you're interested in seeing if you're a fit to work with me as your relationship coach, here's what I invite you to do next. Head over to lovingwithoutboundaries.com/apply. That's lovingwithoutboundaries.com/apply, and book a call to speak with me. I'll get on the phone with you for about 45 minutes, and we'll get you crystal clear on 3 things. Number 1, exactly what's not working well in your relationships right now. Number 2, ideally where you'd like to be and what might be getting in the way. And number 3, the exact strategy to get you there, helping to close that gap. Remember, creating healthy, open relationships does not typically happen by itself. Many often need expert guidance to make it happen. We've helped clients all over the world to feel safe, happy, and secure in open relationships, while not losing their mind or their cherished partners. To see if we can help you do the same, head over to lovingwithoutboundaries.com/apply. I'm Kitty Chambliss, and let's talk soon.